We're going to start my last ever league with my last Storm list where Gitaxian Probe was legal. So I've recorded one league prior to this where we went 4-1, beating a lot of Red-Black Reanimator and a Dragon Stompy deck. And I immediately decided to start another league, which I actually had to get reimbursed. So this is the league directly after that. I'd been having a few beers to celebrate the death of Gitaxian Probe at this point. So I think it's probably pretty sloppy. Having said that, let's get on with it. We're seeing a very long turn 1 portent from our Miracles opponent. And we get to, luckily for us, start with 2 of the aforementioned ban card, Gitaxian Probe, so we're just going to fire one off. I was normally big on holding these for as long as possible. However, if you have multiples, they're well worth just firing off. Just for the information, you can save the second probe for storm count or improving a brainstorm later on. So we fired off the brainstorm here. I believe as we saw a hand completely devoid of force of will, and with a dark ritual and a couple of LEDs in hand, it was worth us, well, just seeing if we could jam. So I think we're just going to lead on a Preordain here. We should really, I guess we're not far off killing. Yeah, so our opponent still has almost nothing. So I think if we can Preordain into any kind of tutor here, we basically win on the spot. Brainstorm might be a good enough, yeah, so we'll keep the Brainstorm as our opponent currently isn't drawing anything. This is one of the reasons why I think Miracles is it can be surprisingly soft game 1 for a deck that runs Counterbalance and a million cantrips and a million pieces of interaction. It can really be soft to just losing fairly early on. So we're just gonna, the Brainstorm's not gonna find anything. A Ponder doesn't find anything. This is starting to get a little bit awkward. At this point, I think it was actually almost worth casting a Dark Ritual, seeing if it resolves. And if it resolves, we're going to Duress and then try to kill via Past in Flames. As I think, the longer we let the game go on for, the less of a chance we have. And, firing off a Dark Ritual into a counterspell, not the worst thing in the world. Instead, we've decided to be a little bit patient, which could bite us pretty badly if my opponent manages to stick a Counterbalance here. Instead, they're going to jam a Jace, which I think is probably pretty good for us. They're going to need to find, I think, something like double force of will at a minimum for us to be particularly worried about their hand. Okay, and a Lotus Petal is actually exactly what we want to draw. We'll fire off the Dark Ritual. See if it gets countered. Probably won't, but it just leaves us with a huge amount of extra mana. Our opponent has pretty much nothing. There's really nothing we're interested in taking here. And I think we can actually, we're not going to bother jamming the Cabal Ritual. The reason we don't bother jamming the Cabal Ritual at the moment is we're kind of not really pressured into it. We can sit in the Cabal Ritual in case we want to flashback past In Flames next turn. So we're just going to redraw a really large number of cards here. Okay, and we find the Infernal Tutor. We had pretty good odds from there just with the amount of cantrips that we had open. We're seeing the power of past In Flames combined with Gitaxian Probe just working as a free redraw engine, especially in matchups like this where your life total just is not pressured at all. I'll just get an easy Tendrils kill from here. Okay, now moving on to game 2, we're going to bring in our 2 copies of Ground Seal to cut off Snapcaster Mage, our 2 copies of Decay to deal with hateful permanents like Counterbalance, and a Xantid Swarm, just as if it resolves, it can spell the end of the game for our opponent fairly quickly. We're going to cut a Lotus Petal as it's kind of one of our weakest anythings in this matchup. We're not particularly hinging on Ad Nauseam as a win con. We're going to cut a Cabal Ritual just because we have to cut something somewhere. It could just as easily be a Lotus Petal. However, we always run the risk of Rest in Peace or not hitting Threshold. It's a bit of a slower ritual. We're going to cut a Preordain just because it's an easy cut. We cut a Swamp as we don't need the extra basic. We're not being threatened with Wasteland, and we're going to cut Dark Petition as, look, if Dark Petition doesn't resolve, you have to sink a lot of resources into being able to cast a Dark Petition, and if it doesn't resolve, you're not looking very good. We'll keep this hand. We have Probe, we have Therapy, we have Abrupt Decay, and we have a fair amount of what we want to go off with. So if we'd drawn an LED or a Tutor there, we probably would have probed. Instead, I think we can wait another turn. We're not worried about our opponent jamming a Counterbalance. We'll deal with that on the spot. And with an open island, it's very likely our opponent has a Brainstorm if we do decide to probe Therapy. There's not a particularly good incentive for our opponent to leave up an untapped basic island unless they have something like Brainstorm or a Flusterstorm to protect them from being 2-for-1'd. So opponent's going to cantrip here. Yep, cantrip here again. I'd expect by now their hand to probably start shaping into something that's going to get rather a lot more difficult for us to beat. And unfortunately, we're just not drawing anything at the moment. So we can afford to be patient. They are cantripping, and this is eventually how they will start to get ahead. They want to turn their handful of cantrips and lands into something that's something like 1 to 2 Snapcasters, a Flusterstorm, a Force of Will, a Counterspell, and a couple of cards for pitch. Okay, so I think now we could probe now. Okay, so we're just deciding to wait. So at some point, if we decide that we have any particular need to deal with the Snapcaster, for instance, if we need to buy some more time, it's fine to burn the Abrupt Decay on that. But we currently have, I guess we're going to say, what, like 10 turns, 9 turns, realistically, with the board state as it is right now, before the Snapcaster is actually a real threat to us. We'll make it 8 because of the Gitaxian Probe. I think we're just trying to settle in for quite a long match here. Our opponent may start to threaten us with V-click, however, soon. Okay, and they've got a reasonably stacked hand. And I think a second Cabal Therapy is exactly what we want. It might pay for us to drop an LED here and pass the turn. The next turn, I think we want to Ground Seal. So we want to draw the Ground Seal next turn. Deploy the Ground Seal, which is going to force him to Surgical, which we're okay with. Or it may cause him to Counterspell. We're not particularly worried either way. So when we start casting therapy, what we really want to be doing is taking his hard counters to begin with. So we'll start by aiming for his Force of Will and his counterspells. Okay, so he's just trying to up the clock right now, as much as anything else. Unfortunately for this game, we've drawn almost nothing but mana here, which is starting to turn into a real problem for us. I mean, it's good to draw the therapies, but unfortunately we really do need to find some business at some point. Past in Flames should do it. So I think we can lead on a Dark Ritual here. we're going to be able to, okay, and we have a lion's eye diamond. So we're fine with the counterspell. Next, I think we need to probably name Force of Will, then Flusterstorm. And I think we want to cast a Dark Ritual in between then. So theoretically, we can pay for this Flusterstorm if we want. Okay, if he's surgical's here, we're going to cast a Dark Ritual. Okay, and we've just successfully managed to run our opponent completely out of interaction. Sorry, not completely out of interaction. We're going to be very slim on redraws here, which is actually something of a problem. The good news for us is I think our opponent will very likely surgical right now. And I think the most likely target for him to surgical will be probably Ponder. So we lead on the duress. This will force him to act. I think we very likely... no, I don't think we have any particularly good good approach to this. We just really need the shuffle. And unfortunately, that's just not going to be good enough for us. What we really need right now, I think we need to shuffle at the end of our turn. And draw an Infernal Tutor. I think if we draw an Infernal Tutor, we can actually still win the game. Barring our opponent having any single piece of interaction. We should have fetched there. So we'd kind of almost like to I don't know what we can possibly brainstorm into here. It's none of this. So we now just need to scoop and move to game 3. No need to change anything in our deck. We were set up appropriately. There can be arguments for trying to bring in Empty the Warrens and trying to get be a very business-heavy deck where we just want to try to resolve storm spells as often and as quickly as possible. I've never been a particularly big fan of Empty the Warrens against Miracles, however, as it either needs to get off very early and put them on an incredibly fast clock and give them as little time as possible to find a Terminus or Sweeper, or if you try to do it too late, you're probably in trouble anyway. We're going to keep this hand. It's a little bit on the mediocre side, but we have some cantrips for consistency, which is what we've been missing. We have Brainstorm, and we have some interaction. So I'm wondering if maybe we should have shuffled there. We saw a ritual and we saw some cantrips. It might just be a little slower than we want to be here. So I think we can put back a Preordain. Yeah. So we now have a green source for the ground seal for next turn. And so all we really want to do is just cast a Ponder and find an Infernal Tutor, I think. So I think we probably want to shuffle that. Okay, I think what we did there was wrong. It does give us access to something like a fetch into a probe, into a therapy, into ground seal, but I'm not sure that's where we want to be in this matchup. I might be just playing a little too conservatively. So I think we're going to grab a Bayou. We have to grab a Bayou here. Okay. An opponent's hand isn't amazing. The V-click is potentially problematic, but something I think we can deal with. And if we force our opponent to use a Force of Will here, I think we're going to be really happy. If he doesn't use a force of will, he might surgical away something like Brainstorm. Which is also not something I think we're terribly concerned about. I think he might have actually been just straight up better shuffling the surgical back into his deck. Okay, and we find the tutor, so that's going to get clicked away next turn. So we probably should have therapied click there. Okay, and so opponent's going to, are they going to upkeep clickers? It looks like they are, so I can only assume that this was an accidental mistake in timing, as I think they should really draw a step. Okay, that's better. So we have to cast Cabal Therapy here. And I think we're going to let him decide what he would like to click rather than firing off the decay. Because if we fire off the decay, he's only got one choice of card to take. Whereas if we sit on the decay, we can just take his clock. I guess Cabal Therapy we need to name Force of Will. We're going to try to probe into something here. Which is unfortunate because we miss. We now know our opponent has a hand that's pretty garbage, but is probably going to start changing fairly quickly from here. And once again, I think if we find an Infernal Tutor, we're just going to try to win. There's only so long we can try to play around Force of Will. Our opponent gets to see another 4 cards per turn. Okay. So we've been a bit unlucky here and just never managed to find... We managed to find our tutor, but a little bit too late. We were bitten by our own misplay there. We should have therapied the click when we had a chance and let him take his 1 draw step. And I think we'll just decay click now. We held off on decaying it before just in case he wanted to drop a counterbalance. But I think we're starting to tap a little bit too low on life now. We'll fetch for the marginal thinning value. And I think if we don't draw a tutor of some sort, no, I think it's already too late. There's not really much we can draw here. Perhaps Past in Flames. That might be our only out. Okay, so we find the Past in Flames. So that was lucky, and we may make it as a result. So the question here is whether or not we want to play around Vendilion Clique, which is what we're doing by casting Past in Flames before the second Cabal Ritual. Now, if our opponent has two pieces of interaction here, we're in a lot of trouble. We should probably fire off the Cabal Ritual here. And we'll flash back the Pith. Now, I would be shocked if they didn't have something like a Flusterstorm now. And unfortunately, that's the game for us.